So to take this discussion further, we're going to be joined via Zoom by Gundo Maswime from the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Cape Town. We're also going to be joined by public policy specialist from Wits University, TK Pooe. A very good afternoon to the both of you, and thank you for your time with us here on the SABC.
Afternoon. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to start with TK at this point, and then Gundo, I'll bring you into the conversation. We've heard sentiments being echoed, perhaps since the Johannesburg inferno occurred. The president, some of the ministers in the engagement speaking about the issue of public infrastructure and housing development in the country, attributing some of the challenges to the structure of apartheid system, the systemic issues. What are your thoughts on those sentiments that had been echoed? TK, let's start with you.
Well, 2 points. One, I think we have to make a distinction between what happened this week tragically in Joburg and what spatial apartheid planning usually is. And I think Mr. Maswime from UCT would touch on that. But what happened in Joburg is an issue of more management of what you told me, your inventory. And I think in this case, it's not a secret. If you look at many CBDs in South Africa, government is very bad at looking after its asset registry. So what happened there is something that we should have been picked up ages ago. Everybody knows that many of these buildings are dilapidated. They are struggling. I don't apportion that to the issue of apartheid spatial planning. I appropriate that to planning and making sure that you know what your asset registry looks like. Now, the broader topic I think you're asking on is how do we conceptualize how people live in cities and how people live in townships in rural areas in South Africa. That while apartheid, yes, does need to be held accountable, we also need to do a few numbers, right? And a few numbers will tell us that it's going to 3 decades now. So that argument cannot work if the government claims to be in charge of many of the key tools that drive public infrastructure. So on that one, I think we just need to make a clear distinction between what happened this week, which I blame it down to an issue of government not looking after its assets properly, and this is just a well-known fact across most of South Africa. It could be that they need new technology to assist them, and then there is a broader issue which, yes, does need to be tackled, which is apartheid spatial planning and how much of appropriate blame we give to government, and also maybe a lack of imagination.
Thanks, TK, for those sentiments. Gundo, let me bring into the conversation on the back of what TK has just echoed now. Perhaps we could look at cities in its current design, the influence of spatial injustice, but really the economic logic of these cities. And perhaps also broadly linked to the political economy for South Africa. How do we begin to make these cities more inclusive at this point?
Thank you. The important thing to note is that what would have happened, for instance, in Johannesburg now is more related to the enforcement of bylaws than it will be related to the legacy of apartheid. I think the only issue where we can bring apartheid in is the fact that, of course, people who were, their residences were outside the periphery of CBDs. Yes, that is true, and it's a legacy of apartheid spatial planning. And in fact, our infrastructure is poorly maintained, and it's also poorly located because I think owing to that spatial planning coming from apartheid. But the maintenance of infrastructure now should not be linked to that. So you have people moving into a building in the CBD. All buildings are supposed to have a fire rating, and the fire rating is a responsibility of the owner of the building. Now, when the building is hijacked, it's not possible to enforce that fire rating because the material that is used to insulate the building, and the fire rating means how long will it take for the building to while it's burning to remain standing, or for people to be able to come out and all of that. So the buildings cannot have a fire rating, but that is more of the enforcement of bylaws, which are there and they are in place, they are clearly written. But I think to bring apartheid back to it, to explain it through apartheid I think that might not be the main reason that we can advance.
So TK, let me bring you back into this conversation then, because I want to then look at the collateral damage of transformation 30 years into our democracy. Perhaps why and how public policy provisions have been failing the public's interests. Is there political will then to address the societal issues at hand?
Well, it goes back to what I said when it comes to imagination. The argument I've always made, especially from a local economic development perspective, is unfortunately, and this is the sad reality of the 30 years of the African National Congress. Oh, look, there have been much to blame, but I also think it's just a lack of imagination. Is we actually only live on three. South Africa's economy is premised on three locations, which is Johannesburg, and here I include Ekurhuleni and Tshwane, because in the reality, these are actually very small places, which should actually be 1 to 3 municipalities in Gauteng. I'd say it's your Joburg, it is Cape Town, and it's Durban. What has then happened is the rest of South Africa is forced to live almost outside the means of the economy. And this is where I think the great problem has become, that when we envision public policy and the rollout of employment, we too often go too quickly, and I think Pretoria probably needs to be held accountable, too quickly towards Joburg, Cape Town, and Durban. What we really do need in South Africa is to actually ask a bigger question. How do we get rural areas and townships in South Africa to not just be part of the local economy, but to be part of the broader international economy? If you look at places I always make the argument with Limpopo and Northwest, how we should be situating those inland provinces. It's not for them to be serving the rest of South Africa, it's for them to be serving the rest of SADC. And I think that's where there's been a lack of political and policy imagination to actually reverse many of the orientation of those economies to be serving SADC. Because if we were to be able to do that, it then becomes an issue of, if you live in Limpopo, if you live in the Northwest, or even if you live in Mpumalanga, you're not forced to have to come into Joburg or to go to Durban, which also almost takes away resources, because if you know how we do our budgets in South Africa, the division of revenue, and also how we split it across provinces, Gauteng is unfortunately at a disadvantage in that while people might have an influx into Gauteng, into KZN, that money is not being put back into the same province. So my argument has always been that we need to ask the question, how do we get Limpopo, Northwest, how do we get the Eastern Cape and those areas to either serve a broader international political economy, and to also really say, listen, not everything has to come to Joburg, because you notice that South Africa is odd in the sense that many developing or developed countries, the economies are based on the coast. We're unique in that much of our economy is inland. And I think that's where we need to really be moving towards, to saying, how do we get our inland provinces to serve the rest of SADC? And how do we get places like the Eastern Cape and KZN to really be saying, listen, you should be exporting more. And what are we going to need to do that in the next 30 years? And you're right in saying it's more than political will. I think it's lack of political imagination.
TK, thank you for that, because I now want to look at the concerns about communities or citizens then acting outside of democratic processes, out of frustration, perhaps even beyond or outside of institutional arrangements, which are ultimately also meant to bridge the gap of local service delivery. Are there concerns on that front for you?
There is, but I think there's a point that, and I've heard, Mr. Maswime almost say this when it comes to how municipalities and the logic of how municipalities are planned in terms of infrastructure, which is the reason sometimes, and we're not going to excuse the criminality here, the reason sometimes a lot of the population is not really brought into the mainstream is because I don't think there's proper public infrastructure in the sense that to understand where communities are. And I've heard Mr. Maswime, I think on this show in countless time, really maybe touch on that point. And I think he probably be best to really maybe ask the question, how do we get public infrastructure to actually become something for the public rather than for the few places?
Gundo, let me bring you into that. How would you like to respond to that? And, given the geostrategic future of South Africa, or towns in South Africa, in the region at large, how does South Africa, begin to look at strengthening what it has, maintaining, but also, look at its role in the global south as well?
Yes, I think TK has actually captured it well, that if you look at the kind of policy interventions that have happened since 1994, we have documented more than 40 in our research. And if you look at rural development strategies, they have mostly ended as strategies. Most of the interventions were on immediate cities, the funding for the immediate. Sorry about that. Let me continue. There was an interruption. Yes, so if you look at most of the strategies, they were focused on rural areas and intermediate cities. So that definitely means a lot of people are going to move into the CBDs, and the CBDs will have more people than they're designed to have. So you must remember that apartheid spatial planning also meant that the cities were not built for the number of people that they are taking up now, even the intermediate cities. So to where funding goes, that is where people are going to go. So most of the funding has been going into the big cities and the intermediate cities, and that has actually fueled this move into the urban areas. But when it comes to the infrastructure, the development of public infrastructure, you must remember that by 1994, there were very few engineers who were within the ANC and would have had the proximity to sit where policies were being discussed. In fact, I have personally investigated that there were only two that we can remember. One became the first city manager of Johannesburg, and the other one was the first Director General for Human Settlements. So there were no engineers who were in the ANC who understood how to run a public infrastructure before. And when the RDP collapsed, there was also a feeling that the engineers who were given the responsibility by virtue of coming from the old order did not support the policies of the new government, and they were doing it half-heartedly. So the RDP had a spectacular collapse from that point of view. So I think there are so many issues at play that I think the ANC must have been set up not to succeed on the infrastructure front. But now we know what the problems are. We've got the critical number of engineers that we need who can influence the policy direction of the ANC and the government, and who can now come up with strategies to get qualified people in the right positions and so on and so forth. But it just looks like we are yet to reach that point where the boldness to do it is there, the boldness to say no one should be appointed as an executive director in a municipality if they are not a qualified civil engineer, for example. So it's things like that that we should be starting to look at now.
TK and Gundo, this conversation is obviously nuanced, and there's so many more questions that come about. But in conclusion, I want to wrap up. I'm going to ask you a closing question. TK, perhaps you could respond. Gundo, you could leave us with the final mark. TK, you spoke about looking or re-looking at the link between urban and rural for capital accumulation in South Africa. And so at this point, given what's transpired in Johannesburg, even on the back of protests that have occurred in the country over the past few years, there's a need for long-term objectives, policy change that is imperative. And I wonder at this point, how do we begin to address the issues beyond the current profit motives as well? How do we begin to rehabilitate and reform?
Well, look, two things, and I'll try to be quick with it. One is, I think we need to relook at how government is structured. And one of the arguments I've always made is province at this state is not needed. Provinces were there for a particular purpose and point. They've served it. They need to go. And the second point is what I think Mr. Maswime has touched on, which is we need to reinvest. And I think here human capital and also public capital into municipalities. I think we have too many at the point. I think for a country the size of South Africa, we need less municipalities, and we need more, I think, engineers and also economists working at local government level.
Thanks, TK. Gundo, in conclusion?
I fully agree with what TK is saying. If you look at the national fiscus, 48%, 49% is going to national government, and there's more than 40% that goes into provincial government. And if you arrive at home today, your electricity is coming from national government, your refuse removal is coming from local government, your roads are mostly coming from local government, the bigger ones are from national government. So you ask yourself exactly what province will be doing, except the administrative channeling of funds from national into the local government. So we may not want to eradicate province completely, but the budget has to, the majority, most of the money is to start going into local government. And we can do that by diminishing the provincial government.
TK Pooe and Gundo, Maswime, thank you for your time with us on the SABC and for weighing in on that discussion there. Again, we're looking at the developments coming on the back of President Cyril Ramaphosa and Minister Lindiwe Zulu, alluding to the issue that occurred in Johannesburg, citing that apartheid spatial planning was a contributing factor. We've taken the discussion further. We're looking at the role of policy, but also 30 years into democracy, the collateral damage of transformation, and really where to from here as we relook and reimagine what, that new South Africa looks like. Thank you to the both of them for their time with us here on the SABC.